Welcome to 10-Minute Edwards, where we learn the theology of Jonathan Edwards 1 minute at a time. I am Kyle Strobel, your host, and the clock starts now. Well, welcome to 10-Minute Edwards. I am Kyle Strobel. It's good to be with you. Man, I love that intro. I hope you got a good laugh at that. It's a bit rock and roll for Jonathan Edwards, I'm not going to lie. But this is the 10-Minute Edwards podcast, a new podcast, and I believe the only podcast, you can quote me on this, that is co-piloted by Jonathan Edwards in hyperspace. So if you're not on video here, that makes no sense. And even if you are on video, it may also make no sense. But nonetheless, it is true. This is something I've thought about doing for a while. For those of you who don't know me, I am a Jonathan Edwards scholar. I've done something called the Jonathan Edwards Project, which is something I'm still working on, that creates resources for the theology of Jonathan Edwards from a kind of beginner all the way to kind of advanced level. What I think of as 101 through like 501 kind of levels, like graduate level stuff. And trying to give people a sense of how do we understand the theology of Jonathan Edwards, who he was, what the problems with it were. I think it'd be naive to read Edwards and not see that there are some places where there's some significant difficulties in his thought, not just conceptual difficulties, but real problems theologically and practically and morally. And so we want to wrestle through those. And for one reason or another, Edwards has been arguably the most important influence on American evangelicalism, particularly. And when you think about American evangelicalism, but particularly the kind of conservative variety, like he is the name that keeps coming up along with the likes of folks like C.S. Lewis. And there's good reason for that. I do think that Edwards is one of the greatest minds in church history. He is a creative thinker who's simultaneously trying to be faithful to the tradition that has been handed to him, but he's also kind of creatively rethinking aspects of it. And so I'm hoping to introduce you to that because his thought can be quite difficult, right? He didn't ever sit down and just kind of write out systematically his views, and so we've had to kind of go and do that for him. For some of you who are new to Edwards, let me just give you a very brief glimpse into some of his biography. Edwards was born in 1703. He was born of Timothy Edwards, who was a pastor and a revivalist pastor in that kind of era. He graduated from Yale with his bachelor's in 1720. He then went back to Yale and graduated again in 1723 with his master's degree. Then in 1726, he ends up in Northampton as a part of the church that his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, was pastoring. This is one of the most significant in terms of kind of notoriety, influence, significance in that sense, kind of like a cultural significance, and a real intellectual significance in terms of the churches of the day. Northampton and particularly Solomon Stoddard were names that would come up rather quickly. He very quickly ended up, after Solomon Stoddard died, kind of inheriting the pastor of that church. And for most of his life, that is what he did. He pastored the church in Northampton. He was eventually fired from his church. I don't know if that should encourage us or discourage us. It could go either way, I suppose. But there's all sorts of reasons why he was fired, some of them on him, some of them on the people, and it's a very mixed bag, as these things often are. He then ends up at Princeton in 1758 to take over the presidency from his son-in-law who had died. And in 1758, Edwards himself ends up dying. Now, of course, that is a very broad sketch. You know, this is 10-Minute Edwards for a reason. Like, we're not going into the kind of the details necessarily of all of these things, or not at all of all these things. You should know something about me is that I'm a systematic theologian. I'm very interested in how to talk about God and the things of God, not historical figures primarily, although I do a lot of historical theology. I'm not really interested in the biography of someone like Edwards. Nonetheless, some of it is going to be very important to consider. And again, for our own, if you're in North American context, like that is significant because so much of our identity stems out of this era. And so it's worthwhile paying attention to. A couple things to note about Edwards. I'm going to put up a slide here. You can just get a very quick sense of what are Edwards's kind of major works. And I put them into three categories. A bit of that is arbitrary, but the faithful narrative of the surprising work of God. This was an early work of Edwards that got a lot of attention, right? This is about the revivals that started happening in Northampton, and this kind of revival movement of this kind of surprising work of God, as he called it, that gave him eventually kind of international renown. He then in 1741 published The Distinguishing Marks of a Work of the Spirit of God. Again, notice he's still in the movement of kind of pastoral questions, revival, but now discerning the Spirit. So, right, how do we discern the Spirit in these kind of seasons? He then writes the book, Some Thoughts Concerning the Present Revival of Religion in New England. Like, notice there's a theme in his earlier writings where you have this real focus on the revivals, both defending them as well as offering guidance for them, right? Because the hope was, and the belief was, that God was going to kind of revive his world through this work of revival, and therefore it was really important to distinguish true from false revival, true from false religious experiences. This work of his particularly culminated in his great work, A Treatise Concerning Religious Affections, which he published in 1746. Now, there's other works, smaller works he's doing, talks and various things, where he is kind of combating what are called the old lights, these kind of intellectualists who were really against the revivals for one reason or another. I could post a link to an article I've done on this. There's some very interesting kind of pre-America, as it were, stuff about some of this that comes in there. But then we also have pastoral discourses and controversies. So I think of something like The Life of David Brainerd, a work that has never been out of print. It was first published in 1749. It was one of the 50 books on the barge to Australia with the prisoners. So there's a very interesting history of Australia here about Australia as a country never being without Jonathan Edwards. His book, Charity and Its Fruits, which was a series of sermons that he gave that was eventually published posthumously in 1852, that I've actually provided my own edition of so that you can go back to the originals, the non-edited one. His great-great-great-grandson, Tyrone Edwards, who edited it, edited out some things that he didn't like, and so I wanted to go back to the original, and I wanted it for sale less than $120, which I think is the Yale edition is in volume 8 of the critical edition of Edwards' works, and it's usually about a $150 volume. So I thought, I want to make this work more readily accessible, and so I partnered with Crossway on that. He then wrote one of my favorite titled books, Discourses on Various Important Subjects. Brilliant title. I wish I could get away with a title like that today. And then A Humble Attempt. And so these are all, again, there's pastoral works, there's controversies, this is a mixture of things. But the works he's known best for outside of the religious affections are his more philosophical and theological treatises, like The Freedom of the Will, which he did in 1754, Original Sin, which he did in 1758, and then a work we call the Two Dissertations, which has often been seen as two distinct works, The End for Which God Created the World, which is part 1, and On the Nature of True Virtue. These were also published posthumously in 1765, but they were readied in the last part of Edwards' life, before he went and eventually took over the presidency of Princeton. Edwards, he was a part of a kind of community where he did a lot of preaching, but also teaching, and particularly teaching of the young children. And he basically kind of took all the notes he'd been writing all his life to kind of articulate his vision of some theological and philosophical subject. This is why he was able to write so much in those later years. So my goal for this podcast, again, if you knew nothing about Edwards, a very broad overview. My goal is to give you an overview of Edwards' theology in 10-minute segments. It is to give you a bit of a crash course in the theology of Jonathan Edwards. And I hope it will introduce you to the riches of his thought, maybe the problems of his thought, and some of the resources that we can kind of avail ourselves of for preaching in our own world today.
Thank you for listening to 10-Minute Edwards. For more information about the Jonathan Edwards Project, check out kylestrobel.substack.com, where you can subscribe for free. All paid subscribers also have access to long-form content on Edwards, Reformed theology and spirituality, and the evangelical spiritual theology tradition that has a word-centered, spirit-empowered, full-life spirituality. Thank you again.